let me simply sort of say the idea here is to draw upon ideas from philosophy. It's also, the intention is to connect these ideas with some more contemporary technological developments that are happening in the world, especially the world of AI, AR, VR, interactive design, the metaverse, and so on. Not that this is going to be the central focus, but the idea is to maybe rethink some of these ideas in the context of what is happening at the moment. But I want to start, though, by saying something directly about this question of AI. And I want to highlight what I feel is a really problematic and troubling misunderstanding of AI that is being propagated in the academic environment by people you would not think would be doing so. This is a book by Joanna Selinska, who teaches in Goldsmiths, which is quite a famous institution in London. And in this book entitled AI Art, she takes a very negative view towards the world of AI and commits, I think, the cardinal sin of people who misunderstand AI. This is her comment. Creativity, another term regularly used to brand such works and declare the success, is reduced here to the repetition of the same. This mechanism is revealed most explicitly in the public and inevitably curatorial fascination with what we may call AI imitation work, also known as style transfer. In other words, what she's saying is AI is simply imitation. It's simply repeating, imitating what is there already. There's nothing in some senses new about what AI is doing. I'm quite shocked to see a book like this being published and being taken seriously, because clearly it is wrong. But that problem is also replicated by Mario Carpo. Mario Carpo teaches at the Bartlett. Admittedly, he's an historian and not a theorist. And as an historian, he tends to see things in a very different way and maybe doesn't have an understanding of technology, at least that's my impression. But he makes exactly the same mistake of assuming that AI is just mere imitation. And here's a comment he made in an article in Art Forum just recently. Regardless of terminology, visual imitation, style transfer are what AI-based image-making technologies basically do, and so do we when we use them. In some senses, I feel that some of these articles should have a warning on them, a kind of like smoking damages the health. This article will seriously damage your understanding of AI, or possibly we should be fact-checking them, because it seems to me that this is irresponsible, and it is a complete misunderstanding of what AI is. AI does not copy. Humans copy, and I'll talk a bit about that now, but AI does not copy. Typically, if you want to understand what AI does, it searches and synthesizes. It searches and synthesizes. This is an early example, one of the first examples of DALL-E 2. And what was really shocking about this was the way in which DALL-E 2 was able to respond to this prompt. Now, the prompt is a very short prompt, very straightforward prompt, an astronaut on a horse. Now, let's assume that there's never been an astronaut on a horse. Maybe there has, and maybe it was captured and photographed, but let's assume there wasn't. So what exactly is this image imitating? It's not. What it's doing is searching and synthesizing. By synthesizing, I mean it's putting together two unrelated concepts, an astronaut and a horse, and showing us what it would look like if an astronaut were to be riding a horse. In other words, there's no imitation, it is searching and synthesizing. And we can see this also, and I'm just showing you some of my own work, Midjourney, in the way that we treat architecture. I have been using Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion in a series of prompts. In fact, I've used it many times, possibly 5,000 or so times, because inevitably, when you do a study, you do you generate many outcomes. Now, what I found with this is that it treats the Barcelona Pavilion as a kind of shape grammar. It takes the components, never gets the components exactly right in the first place, never gets the proportions and so on, but takes their components as a kind of shape grammar that it kind of mixes in an arbitrary fashion. You might see some sense of resemblance to the Barcelona Pavilion, maybe, but it's a very distant sense of resemblance. And in this series of 5,000 or more, 5,000 or more images, I never once saw anything that remotely resembled the actual Barcelona Pavilion. But what is curious about this is that AI also works through a kind of process that basically is connecting things together. In other words, when it searches for something, it searches and it brings together all the associations connected with that particular word. It is associative in the way that it responds. Now, this was a particular prompt that I produced, and I was puzzled. The term I used, and I was trying to, the term I used was house extension, and I was curious as to why this building had it was an extension of a very British-looking house. It was particularly because it was intended for James Turrell, an American conceptual artist. Why would I see a British house in the background? Well, it turns out, I didn't realize this, the term house extension is a British term. In the States, I think they have a term of home enlargement or home addition, which is very different. Now, what was interesting was when I changed that prompt, I just removed the word extension that had made it into a very British thing. And I got this. This is James Turrell in possibly his right environment. We see palm trees here. James Turrell was born in LA. He has spent a lot of his life on projects in Arizona. It is casting James Turrell in the context of Arizona. In other words, it's not just talking about James Turrell. It's not just referring to James Turrell. It's conjuring up an entire world, the world from which James Turrell comes. It is based on the logic of associations and associative thinking. And this is, in fact, the way that human beings also work. We adopt associative thinking as a kind of protection mechanism. If we touch our hand on a stove that is red, we know from experience we are going to get burnt. So we don't do that. In fact, we probably don't even touch the stove in the first place. Whether or not it is red, we know that there's a danger that it is going to be hot. In other words, human beings, just like neural networks, think in terms of associations. As such, we have to sort of question the critique that I mentioned yesterday, the critique of this ocular-centric, this image-obsessed approach in architecture. What basically Henri Lefebvre is saying is that the image reduces the world to mere images, to the world of the image, which is the enemy of the imagination. It fetishizes abstraction and imposes it as the norm. What I want to argue today, that precisely the opposite happens, that actually the world of images, the world of representation, can also open up and effectively feed the imagination. After its fashion in the image kill, it is like all science. My suggestion is that the image is never the simple image. So the whole discourse that was going on a few years ago about the discourse of the everyday that I mentioned yesterday, the idea that somehow we are overlooking the other senses is clearly wrong. What I'm suggesting is that when we see something, let's say we see this cake, we automatically almost start salivating because we know roughly what it's going to taste like. We certainly know what the strawberries will be tasting like. In other words, when we look at the world, it's ideation. The vision is a way of conveying other emotions. if I walk towards a door and I see a door handle, a metal door handle, I probably know already that it might be cold, that it might be hard. I already have an anticipation of what it's going to feel like because my way of thinking and vision itself is associative. Now, not does it only simply kind of associate a taste, shall we say, with a vision. In other words, vision doesn't simply convey the other senses, it also opens up an entire world. Just as we saw James Turrell's world opened up in Arizona in the desert by a simple reference, so too we see in this reference here, this comment here about Proust, a similar thing. Famously, in his book, À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, Proust, the French novelist Proust, refers to the example of Madeleine cakes. Well, actually, in this article in The Guardian, they're saying, in fact, originally it was going to be toast. But what happens in the story about the Madeleine cakes is when he eats the Madeleine cakes, he gets transported into another world, a world of memories, where all the associations of those Madeleine cakes come alive. In other words, through taste, through perception, through representation in some ways, the whole world opens up. I want to argue that the same thing happens with images. It's as though when we see an image, we, as it were, step through the mirror, through the looking glass, to use a term from Lewis Carroll. We step through the looking glass into another world. So here is an actual, it's a bit dark, unfortunately, but an actual clip from the story of the looking glass. And you see a butterfly disappearing through the mirror into the world outside. And Alice here puts her finger into the mirror and then discovers that she can penetrate through the mirror into another world that is beyond. And you can't hear this because the sound is switched off, but there's someone knocking on the door saying, let me in, who's in there, who's in there? And so she decides that she's going to escape. She's going to escape, she's going to follow the butterfly and jump through that mirror while this person is trying to rattling the door handle and go through that mirror into another world. And there we have it. And that is what I want to suggest is what's happening when we're dealing with the world of representation. It's not the kind of critique that we spoke about in the last 2 days of missing out on the most almost magical side of what it can do, how it can, as it were, conjure up a different world. And this is, I think, something that is deeply important. So maybe we should just see her step through the looking glass one more time, and I think which is an astonishing sort of moment in a sense. The mirror I will talk about in a few days' time. In fact, next session, the mirror is central to have questions of identification. We identify with the world through reflections. And the mirror, through the logic of Lacan, as we'll see, is central to thinking about how identification itself takes place. Okay. So just to kind of put this in the context of what we've been looking at so far, we've had 2 sessions, reality and aestheticization, and we now have 4 more sessions. The first 2 sessions were basically following the logic, if I got it in here, yes, following the logic of this book on the left-hand side, The Anesthetics of Architecture, which was a very negative critique of the world of images. And it was following on from the work of Jean Baudrillard in particular, and following through that logic. It was also, I'd say, a rather undialectical approach. In other words, although I knew there are other sides of the argument, in order to mount a polemic, I kept out the other side of the argument to make it more powerful. Camouflage is itself a kind of response to it. Camouflage is a far more subtle, a far more dialectical book, and a far more intellectual book. A colleague of mine once described it as being deep fried theory, which is like the theory version of fish and chips. And I come from the UK, where fish and chips come from. So today I want to go and look at camouflage, to go back a second, and I want to look at it primarily through this term mimesis, that basically is referring to precisely what we saw, Alice in Wonderland, stepping into another world. It's talking how the world representation, for all its problems, actually is incredibly powerful in evoking worlds, in summoning up things, and has a very significant role to play in the world of architecture itself. So this is the book itself, and let me just simply say something about the cover itself. So the section, maybe also, I mentioned the section, the four sections I'm going to be looking at, first of all, looking at the question of camouflage in a literal sense, looking at the principle of adaptation, which I want to argue is fundamental not only to human existence, but to the existence of all creatures, and thinking how we adapt, especially to architectural spaces. And then the theme of mimesis, which I won't go into in complete detail, but I'll try and give you an overview of, which is the concept that is so powerful that opens up all these kind of questions. And finally, I want to return to the world of neuroscience and AI in the final section when I look at the question of modeling. And these are the figures that I'll be talking about. Benjamin, again, of course, I mentioned last week, Adorno and Henri Lefebvre, whom I've already mentioned. And I'll simply say that Francesca Woodman was the person who was responsible for the images in the book. Now, this is Francesca Woodman. She was an American photographer, a very, very talented American photographer, who possibly was operating at the wrong time because she was into a kind of form of realism, shall we say, when abstraction was very big in the world of photography. But now she's been recognized as one of the greatest photographers of all time, and she's been reappraised in some senses. Tragically, Francesca Woodman committed suicide I think it was in the early 80s when she was in her early 20s. In other words, she was a bit like Sylvia Plath, the amazing American poet who also tragically committed suicide. And that notion of how the poetic and the artistic can be related to melancholia will be something that we will be addressing in the penultimate session. But I want to simply point out here that most of her photographs are of herself, and this particular series is really taking on the logic of camouflage itself. So what we see here are the as a kind of fish, skeleton of fish bones here, and this is kind of echoing the reinforcement that is in the plasterwork behind it, which has been kind of pulled away in some senses. So in other words, there's a kind of attempt to, as it were, to camouflage oneself against the background, or in this particular one where she's wrapping herself in wallpaper, as it were, hiding away and becoming part of the building, building. And again, the camouflage logic as she's set against her background, or here, almost like a child playing hide and seek, kind of concealing herself behind the fireplace. Here, camouflaged against these plants, wearing a dress that echoes those plants, and so on. So the deeply poetic set of photographs, and of course the mirror, which we will talk about more, is central to this. The notion of identification, of camouflage identification, is central to her work. Then at one point, I did not need to translate the notes. They went directly to my hands. So this was in the book itself. These are the photographs that I use, and every single chapter has one of these astonishing, very powerful photographs. I had to get permission from her parents to reproduce this because obviously she herself was dead, but amazing. And here, the final one, you can see how more clearly, in some senses, how the reinforcing is kind of connected to the skeleton of the fish that she was holding. Now, this idea of camouflage as a kind of defense mechanism, as a mechanism of survival, shall we say, is something that we can see throughout the animal kingdom. It's a tactic of survival. It involves the visual and the notion of survival, and therefore we can see it very literally connected to the notion of camouflage, which depends on both. Here we can see a shrimp. We can hardly even see the shrimp because it's become invisible, but against the backdrop of this other creature, we can begin to just briefly detect the outline of that shrimp, which is doing this, becoming invisible, becoming transparent in order not to be seen. Similarly, we can see a number of insects, some stick insects. Maybe perhaps in some of these images, there aren't any creatures. Maybe it's just sticks, but actually, I'll be honest here, this is a stick insect. And it's using this tactic to blend in with its environment as a kind of tactic of survival. And there are many, many examples from the animal kingdom of the possibility of just simply blending in by camouflaging oneself, as it were, against this backdrop. And of course, the ultimate creature in some senses of adaptation is the chameleon. And what makes the chameleon so interesting, apart from the fact that it can change its color, is the fact that actually it doesn't have any sense of smell and doesn't have any ears. It has got very, very weak sense of smell, no sense of smell. Yet its optical apparatus, shall we say, is incredibly sophisticated. It's the one creature that can see in perspective in 360 degrees, and it has a pixelation, as it were, of the eye that is incredibly refined. It is a very, very refined creature in terms of its optical apparatus, and it uses that optical apparatus in order to survive. It adapts, it changes its color to fit in. It also changes its color to stand out on occasion. When it's kind of in moments of, let's say, courting and so on, the chameleon will turn bright orange. But the logic remains the same, of relating to your background either by standing out or blending in. But maybe the most astonishing, watch this a second, out of this, what seems to be a bush or something, suddenly you will see an octopus appearing. The most sophisticated one is the octopus, something that's a creature that many have written about, that is an amazing creature in its own right. It is able to change because it works in a very different way to the chameleon itself, and the way that it changes is far more immediate. In fact, you can see in the next video I want to show you. And what's more, it also not just it can change its color, it also change its shape. You can sometimes get an octopus that is pretending to be a fish, and it looks quite convincing as a fish. This one here, you can see how amazingly quickly it can suddenly change its color. And again, this is about survival, about trying to protect itself. It doesn't have any kind of hard shell around it. The only mechanism that these creatures have to survive is to use this kind of very sophisticated kind of camouflaging technique. And truly remarkable, truly remarkable. The speed at which it can change color is really astonishing. So the animal kingdom has got this is fundamental to everything that in the animal kingdom. They're continually adapting, using this optical technique as a mechanism of survival. And as such, it is not so dissimilar to the logic of camouflage. Here we see a soldier wearing camouflage in a military situation. The camouflage is to allow him to prevent him from being seen. It is about survival, and it is to do with optical operations. And in winter, of course, you change to white color camouflage. And it's the same principle. And what is interesting, though, about the logic of camouflage is once fashion becomes, because once camouflage becomes a fashion, then you begin to sort of see that fashion itself is a form of camouflage, of relating oneself to the environment, either by standing out or by blending in. In this case, presumably standing out by wearing something that is kind of looking trendy. So camouflage is a logic that is there. And in many ways, I would say that human beings are a little like chameleons in the sense that we also privilege the visual. We also rely heavily on the visual. Although we've got a sense of smell, a sense of hearing, of course, unlike the chameleon, we don't have the same sense of smell or the same range of hearing that a dog has, for example. So we are, in a sense, chameleons. So I want to also say something now about the logic of adaptation. And this is one of my favorite pieces in terms of the logic of let's say, camouflage. This was a piece that was exhibited in the Venice Biennale. It was a Venice Art Biennale in the Korean Pavilion a few years ago. And what you can see is these kind of, they're actually soldiers, camouflage, but wearing flowers, a deeply kind of ironic piece, but also a very, very beautiful piece that speaks about the possibility of losing oneself in an environment, as it were, playing dead in order to survive. And the theme of life and death, of surrendering or sacrificing the self in order to survive, is something that we'll be talking about more next week. But the logic of adaptation, it seems, is fundamental to human life and fundamental to the way in which we survive. The comment that I make in Camouflage, which I want to try and pick up on, is that that human beings not only camouflage themselves, but also we adapt. We adapt in the sense we make ourselves familiar with the unfamiliar. We always tend to go back to the familiar thing. We always tend to repeat things in some ways. We always maybe choose the same numbers for the lottery and so on. We always are kind of fixated by the familiar in the things that we do. But when we're forced to, human beings are very, very good at adapting, especially to new tools. And that argument has been made about AI and about all these new tools, that human beings are the creatures that really are most adaptive and most capable of becoming these kind of cyborg-like creatures, precisely because of the plasticity of the brain itself. And this is an argument made by Andy Clark that I will be referring to again in a few lectures' time. Human beings are adaptive creatures like anyone else in the world itself. And I want to play you now a video of a really extraordinary film called Zelig. It's by Woody Allen, and it tells the story of an American emigre, a Jewish immigrant who arrives in New York and wants to become part of everything, wants to blend in. But he has this extraordinary capacity to blend in beyond the way that anyone else would blend in. So let me just play you an excerpt for this so you can get a sense of this kind of idea of someone. He's referred to in the movie as the human chameleon. So let's just watch this for a moment.
He was the phenomenon of the 20s. When you think that at that time he was as well known as Lindbergh, it's really quite astonishing.
His story reflected the nature of our civilization, the character of our times, yet it was also one man's story, and all the themes of our culture were there: heroism, will, things like that. But when you look back on it, it was very strange.
Well, it is ironic to see how quickly he has faded from memory, considering what an astounding record he made. He was, of course, very amusing, but at the same time touched a nerve in people, perhaps in a way in which they would prefer not to be touched. It certainly is a very bizarre story.
The year is 1928. America, enjoying a decade of unequaled prosperity, has gone wild. The jazz age, it is called. The rhythms are syncopated, the morals are looser, the liquor is cheaper, when you can get it. It is a time of diverse heroes and madcap stunts, of speakeasies and flamboyant parties. One typical party occurs at the Long Island estate of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Porter Sutton, socialites, patrons of the arts. Politicians and poets rub elbows with the cream of high society. Present at the party is Scott Fitzgerald, who is to cast perspective on the 20s for all future generations. He writes in his notebook about a curious little man named Leon Selwyn, or Zellman, who seemed clearly to be an aristocrat and extolled the very rich as he chatted with socialites. He spoke adoringly of Coolidge and the Republican Party, all in an upper-class Boston accent. An hour later, writes Fitzgerald, I was stunned to see the same man speaking with the kitchen help. Now he claimed to be a Democrat, and his accent seemed to be coarse, as if he were one of the crowd. It is the first small notice taken of Leonard Zelig. Florida, 1 year later. An odd incident occurs at the New York Yankees training camp. Journalists, anxious as always to immortalize the exploits of the great home run hitters, notice a strange new player waiting his turn at bat after Babe Ruth. He is listed on the roster as Lou Zelig, but no one on the team has heard of him. Security guards are called, and he is escorted from the premises. It appears as a small item in the next day's newspaper. Chicago, Illinois, that same year. There is a private party at a speakeasy on the south side. People from the most respectable walks of life dance and drink bathtub gin. Present that evening was Calvin Turner, a waiter.
And a lot of customers, a lot of gangsters come into place because they're always good tippers and take good care of us. And of course, we try to take care of our customers. But on this particular night, I looked over, and here's a strange guy coming in. I'd never seen him before. So I asked one of the other, I said, John, do you know this guy? You ever seen him? So he looks. I said, no, I ain't never seen him before, man. I don't know who he is, but I know one thing. He's a tough-looking hombre. So I looked over, and then next thing, the guy had disappeared. I don't know where he went to. But about this time, you know, the music gets started, and the band started playing. I looked, and here's a guy, a colored guy, and a colored boy over there playing trumpet. Man, he was playing back. Then I looked at the guy and I said, well, my goodness, he looks just like that gangster. But the gangster was white, and this guy is black. So I don't know what's happening.
New York City. It is several months later. Police are investigating the disappearance of a clerk named Leonard Zelig. Both his landlady and his employer have reported him missing. They tell police he was an odd little man who kept to himself. Only 2 clues are found in Zelig's Greenwich Village flat. One, a photograph of Zelig with Eugene O'Neill, and one of him as Pagliacci. Acting on a tip, they trace his whereabouts to Chinatown, where in the rear of a Chinese establishment, a strange-looking Oriental who fits the description of Leonard Zelig is discovered. Suspicious, the detectives try to pull off his disguise, but it is not a disguise, and a fight breaks out. He is removed by force and taken to Manhattan Hospital. In the ambulance, he rants and curses in what sounds like authentic Chinese. He is restrained with a straitjacket.
Okay, this is a very amusing story. And here you see him on the left-hand side. You put him in with some Native Americans, and he turns into a Native American. Then the scene that probably from that section there with some black jazz musicians, he himself turns into a black jazz musician. And then maybe even the most charming aspect of it, when he becomes this curiosity, he becomes part of a freak show for a while, but also a medical curiosity. And what's so interesting is when he's being examined by psychiatrists, he himself turns into a psychiatrist. In other words, he blends into and becomes part of everything that is around him. And this is, in fact, one of the comments made in the movie by Bruno Bettelheim, is to say, well, actually, this is what everybody is like in some senses. It's just he takes it to an extreme degree. In a sense, he completely loses his sense of identity and becomes part of the world around it. Or rather, we could maybe say the opposite. Maybe he's doing this in order to preserve his sense of identity. As someone new, he's trying to blend in. He just wants to be liked. I won't go into the rest of the story, but it's an intriguing story. It's one of Woody Allen's most important, best movies, as far as I'm aware. The question, though, that really becomes interesting is, okay, so we can assimilate to the people around us, we can identify with them, but how do we identify with buildings? This was a question I once put to Luce Irigaray, the French feminist thinker, when she came to give a lecture at the Architectural Association. And she told me, no, you can't identify with buildings. That's sad. You can only identify with other human beings. But then she was telling me about how upset she was that she was being forced out of her apartment because the owner of the apartment was going to be selling the property, and how it was distressing her. And I said, but hold on a second. You just told me that you're upset to be leaving your apartment. Isn't that not an indication of the fact that you have formed an attachment to that apartment? Anyway, so for many years, or for some time, I was trying to work out how could we elaborate a kind of theory of identification with buildings. And I knew from the world of critical theory that people often refer to Lacan, to the mirror stage, and so on in their discussions. But I was trying to find out any mechanism for identification with buildings. And I came across this. In fact, when I first read this, I read this comment, and it's in an article, Functionalism Today, in my book, Rethinking Architecture. I read it and I thought, I don't know what the hell it means, and I skipped to the next sentence. But this is the comment, and it's by Theodor Adorno, a close associate of Benjamin, who I will talk about, and both of them were very interested in this concept of mimesis. According to Freud, symbolic intention quickly allies itself to technical forms like the airplane, and according to contemporary American research in mass psychology, even to the car. We identify with our cars, we start calling them names and so on. Thus, purposeful forms are the language of their own purposes. And this is the comment. By means of a mimetic impulse, the living being equates himself with objects in his surroundings. Well, that's his words. The living human beings equate themselves with objects in their surroundings. And it comes from Freud, this comment. And it comes from the book on jokes, on wits that Freud published. And he raises this question of what he calls ideational mimetics. I believe that if ideational mimetics are followed up, they may be useful in other branches of aesthetics. So what does he mean by this? So let's say, of a joke. There's a joke of, this is Charlie Chaplin slipping over a banana skin. Now, how do we relate to the Charlie Chaplin slipping over? Well, the mechanism of mimesis implies that you identify by modeling yourself on him. You recall bodily memories of what it is to slip up on ice or something, and you imagine, by putting yourself in that position, what it is like to slip over a banana skin. But importantly, you're able to extract yourself and be able to laugh at this joke rather than be totally lost in that situation. It seemed to be the problem with Zelli. So we can understand Charlie Chaplin by modeling ourselves on Charlie Chaplin, drawing upon bodily memories, and thereby identifying with that person. But the most important point that he makes, Freud, is to say this has got huge potential in the world of aesthetics, but nobody I came across had followed it up, apart from Adorno to some extent. So the term mimesis, let me just say that it comes from the Greek. It's literally, it means kind of a copying, mimicry, and so on. But it's a creative form of mimicry. It's not the kind of the straightforward imitation, the banal imitation. It's rather the way in which we can, in fact, we can creatively identify with the other through modeling ourselves on the other, through a kind of form of mimicry. In other words, copying is never straight copying. It is a kind of personal version of copying. We personalize it and we identify with our own way. And Adorno uses this in the context of Adolf Loos. He wrote an essay called Functionalism Today, which is in Rethinking Architecture. And he offers a critique of the essay by Adolf Loos, Ornament and Crime. And those of you who know that essay will know that he goes into this diatribe about ornament, talking about how ornament is decadent, how it shouldn't be allowed, and comparing it to tattoos. Anyone who's got a tattoo should be in prison or is about to go to prison, and comparing it to graffiti in toilets and so on. Somehow, for him, ornament is extremely decadent. And yet what happens with what Loos points out, Adorno points out, is this is actually quite undialectical, because not only do you get this quite sensuous way of handling form in loose, but in occasions extremely sensuous forms. And the point that Adorno makes is that it's undialectical because what you find in terms of the distinction between, let's say, decorative things, ornament, and functional things is not so clear-cut. In fact, many forms of decoration or social acts and so on have a function. And he gives the example of dance. Dance has a social function. In other words, Adorno is kind of in denial in some sense, and there is already a form of sensuousness, and that exists in his work. Walter Benjamin also picks up on this. And of course, in the 1920s, Benjamin and Adorno were heavily influenced by the work of Freud and the Freudian impulses throughout this work. Benjamin had been obsessed with, let's say, a prehistory of the modern, especially the 19th century. On the left-hand side, the only photograph that we have of a French interior. And he wrote about these French interiors in terms of the sumptuousness of them, the kind of the phantasmagoria, the kind of overload, as it were, of visual stimulation. And he described these places as being like a sort of like a cocoon in some way. It's like a woven cocoon, and it's as though humans fit in this cocoon. And he uses the example of a velvet instrument case, the way that the instruments fit into the case, as though they leave their imprint. And he describes the inside of the shell of a nut in a similar way. So in some senses, these interiors embodied their users. They showed evidence of their users. They were there to cocoon, to become like a womb, a kind of place of refuge. And then on the right-hand side, you get this is the Mensa of the Bauhaus in Dessau, Germany, a place I know well because I taught there for many years. And in some ways, in Benjamin, you're not quite sure whether he's being critical of this new world or not. His work of art essay, which is a critique of photography, in which he, in some senses, bemoans the loss of aura you get with photography, can be read both ways. And I think also, in some senses, this could be read in a certain way. In the abstraction of contemporary world, how can you manage to redeem something of the connectivity of the sensuous correspondence of those old interiors? Can we rely upon design itself? And I would simply say, and maybe this is perhaps a too good an example of the Bauhaus, but this is a kind of quite a brutalist space. I lived there, literally, in one of the rooms in the Bauhaus, completely concrete floors, very, very sparse and minimal. But such was the design content. It was an amazing place to stay, an amazing place. So it wasn't a question of having kind of cozy furnishings. At the same time, it became a place, an astonishing place, a very invigorating place in which to operate. And I would claim that that is the central message today, that design itself can locate us, can give us a sense of who we are and where we are. And this was a comment that was made by Frederick Jameson about the necessity in a world where we have lost our cognitive mapping, our sense of bearing, our sense of where we are in the homogenizing space of late capitalism. How do we find a place in which to operate? And he mentions, this is one of the ideas that fed into the book, is that what we need today is a viable form of aesthetic expression that reinserts the individual within the world itself. And that, I would claim, is the role of design, to reinsert you in the world itself. And it's all based on this notion of copying, but never a simple, straightforward copying. It's a creative form of copying, an adaptation that is copying, that is not copying. And one of the points that are made by both Benjamin and Adorno is this is how the world operates. This is how the world happens. It's by watching things that we learn things. Apparently, a bird will watch its mother and learn how to fly and so on. Similarly, we might watch people surfing and realize what it's like to surf. We can kind of put ourselves in the position of that, of the surfer, like in the joke about Charlie Chaplin slipping over banana skin. through the comparison, through the similarity, through the imitation, as it were, of that thing. In other words, it's a creative form of engagement. Nature creates similarities. One only need to think of mimicry. One need only think of mimicry. The highest capacity for reproducing similarities, however, is man's. We constantly copy. We copy other people who are the fashion they're wearing. They're wearing Nike shoes. We buy Nike shoes. If they're playing some music, we copy ourselves. Let's not think that people are not copying. It is fundamental to human existence. Every day, the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction. And this is a comment that Adorno makes. A human is indissolubly linked with imitation. A human becomes human at all by imitating other human beings. That is an incredibly important statement. But the other point, the other statement I have here, mimetic behavior does not imitate something, but it assimilates itself to that something. By copying, you are assimilating. You're becoming part of the crowd. By playing certain music, you are part of the in crowd because you're playing the same music or wearing the same clothes that are in fashion. It's precisely by copying that you assimilate. In other words, the intention of mimesis is not just to be the same, but to assimilate. It's an assimilative process of becoming adapted to something else. And children have an incredible capacity to adapt. This fades away as we get older, but it's an amazing capacity to imagine oneself in a different scenario. And here he describes the situation of a child playing hide and seek. Hide and seek is a game we play in the West where children hide away and then one tries to come and find them. And the whole idea is to not be found. But at the same time, there's a worry that if you aren't found, you might be locked into this post forever. So this is Benjamin in One Way Street. Standing behind the doorway curtain, the child becomes himself something floating and white, a ghost. The dining table under which he is crouching turns him into the wooden idol in a temple whose four pillars are the carved legs. And behind a door, he is himself a door, wears it as his heavy mask, and as a shaman will bewitch all those who unsuspectingly enter. And at no cost must he be found. When he pulls his faces, he is told, the clock need only strike, and he will remain so. The element of truth in this he finds out in his hiding place. Anyone who discovers him can petrify him as an idol under the table, weave him forever as a ghost into the little curtain, banish him for life into the heavy door. And so at the seeker's touch, he drives out with a loud cry the demon who had transformed him. Indeed, without waiting for the moment of discovery, he grabs the hunter with a shout of self-deliverance. So the child hiding wants to be found so that that child is not locked into this particular place of hiding. And it's something that kind of is part of the way that we operate. We become like the world around us. For example, you see owners of dogs start behaving like their dogs, and the dogs start behaving like their owners. And this principle of adaptation, of mutual adaptation, is fundamental to what he's talking about. And here, Benjamin's talking about how, as a small child, he goes around catching butterflies and how he himself becomes like a butterfly. The more I got butterflies in the stomach, the more the butterfly did all it could and didn't do, that took on the color of human resolution. Until finally, it is as if capturing it was the price, the only way I would regain my humanity. In other words, we become like the butterfly, and the butterfly becomes like us. And it's the child's imagination which is really astonishing. We can see children playing, and they're not just playing at being shopkeepers or teachers or whatever. And there's a theory that this is how we learn to play roles. We learn how to become an architect. When we were playing as a kid, we were playing cops and robbers, or these games or doctors and nurses, or doctors and patients, or whatever. It is as a child, by learning these things, by playing these roles, that we learn how to become a doctor or an architect or an engineer or whatever, a police person or something in the future. But it's also, what is remarkable about this is the fact that you are able to, children are able to identify with physical objects. They're able to identify with a windmill or a train or indeed a plane or whatever. That's what kids do when they're playing in the playground. The child plays at being not only a shopkeeper or teacher, but also a windmill and a train. And let's not forget the story about the game of hide and seek, where the kid gets lost, absorbed within its background, within its surroundings. And it is this childish imagination that is so important. Adorno draws the distinction between the childish tantrum, which is the dark side of the child, and this childlike openness. And what I would argue is that to maintain that childlike openness, and I think of someone like Peter Cook, someone who's 80, but actually he's youthful in the way he operates. If you maintain that childlike openness, you remain open to the world itself. You mean far more creative, rather than closing down, you're open to possibilities. And here, in the second quote, he's referring to the world of mimesis itself. In time, I learned to disguise myself in words which were actually clouds, for the gift of seeing likeness is nothing but a weak vestige of the old compulsion to become and act like something else. But words exercise this coercion on me, for those that made me resemble models of good behavior, and those that made me like dwellings, furniture, clothing. So the child is able to kind of turn itself, adapt in a way that maybe older people cannot. And similarly, in a kind of creative way, the child is able to take little ordinary objects and fantasize that they are something different. In the child's bureau, drawers become arsenal and zoo, crime museum and crypt. To tidy up would be to demolish an edifice full of prickly chestnuts that are spiky clubs, tin foil that is hoarded silver, bricks that are coffins, cacti that are totem poles, and copper pennies that are shields. It is the child imagination. You can take a box and turn it into a building. That is precisely what we are talking about here. And it's this question of adaptation and how we absorb all these things that become part of the way we are. The rhythm of streetcars and carpet playing rocked me in my sleep. It was the mold in which my dreams took shape. So the child becomes this privileged figure who is open to all sort of possibilities and able to imagine other possibilities. So this is the theme of mimesis that I'm sketching out here without going into any great detail. I would simply say that this book is actually available on my website if you want to read it. There's a copy up there, and of course you can buy it on Amazon. And it's basically, this is a short overview of this. There's much more in it than this. And this is the kind of the fundamental thing that I'm trying to address, the way in which we begin to sort of familiarize ourselves with the world around us. It is as though we human beings are dominated by the compulsion to return to the familiar, or when there is nothing familiar to be found, to familiarize ourselves with the unfamiliar. So what I mean by this exactly, in fact, I'm not necessarily talking here about physically becoming like the world, like the camouflage logic of the octopus or the chameleon. I'm not talking about the physical object. I'm talking about how you might think yourself into the world around you. Now, let me just give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. I'm sure that we've all been in this situation, especially the students here, when you've got to go and stay in a hotel one evening. And of course, you want to go and stay in the Zaha designed hotel, but it's like $500 and you know you can't possibly afford to stay there. So you end up in some really cheap hotel, a one-star hotel, right? And it's, you know, it's smelly. It's kind of the paint is peeling, perhaps the carpet's dirty. It's not very pleasant. But what is interesting about this is after about 2 or 3 nights of staying in that hotel, you start getting fond of it. You start getting attached to the space. So by the time you move out, you almost feel kind of reluctant to leave. And this is a kind of curious syndrome that plays out the whole time. We adapt. And the same happens when we move to a new town, to a new apartment block or whatever. To begin with, it seems strangely unfamiliar, but we grow into it. We grow into our architectural surroundings through our ideas. It is ideational. We adapt to it, not by becoming physically similar to it. We adapt to it by thinking our way into that space. An interesting example of this is this particular building in the Bay Area. This is the Alcatraz Penitentiary. It's now a museum. You can go walk around it, but it used to be a prison. And what is interesting, if you do walk around it, there's an audio-visual guide you can take where you get the prisoners talking about their experiences there. And there's one particular prisoner I was very struck by his comments. His name is Leon Whitey Thompson, and he talks about his relationship to his cell. And he says that after a while, I got to know everything in my cell, every scratch, every mark in the cell. And when I came back to my cell in the evening, it was like coming back to an old friend. I became part of my cell, and my cell became part of me. That's a very, very, very curious example. But there's another example. There's an example of Nelson Mandela. And an architect friend of mine in South Africa was telling me that when Nelson Mandela was released from house arrest back in 1989, he had a house built for himself. And this architect knew the architect who'd been commissioned. And of course, this was an incredible opportunity to design a building for one of the world's greatest ever human beings. But when Nelson Mandela came into the room, this architect was a bit disconcerted because he came in with a roll of buildings, with a roll of drawings. And he rolled out the drawings on the table and he said, I want you to build me one of these. What that drawing was, what those designs were for the very house in which he had been kept under house arrest. And Nelson Mandela, for several years, lived in this replica of the house in which he had been imprisoned. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us basically that actually the urge to adapt, the urge to become part of the world around us, is perhaps most acute when we are in a situation where we have to adapt in some way. In other words, in the context of a prison, we adapt even more than in the context of something else. But then the question that it raises then is, in that case, is design not important? Will we adapt to anything, no matter what? The answer to this question is provided by Adorno, who says, no, the fact that we want to adapt to the world around us is precisely why design is so important. And the term he uses for this is sensuous correspondence. The term sensuous correspondence, and this is my quote here, such a sensibility might produce an architecture of sensuous correspondence, an imaginative and intuitive architecture which breaks free from the harsh strictures of enlightenment and rationality, an architecture that both invigorates and innovates. The idea that it might be something, as it were, poetic. And Mimesis is very much contrasted to a kind of objective, rational outlook on life. And if let's take an example of, say, of literature, that objective, rational outlook on life might be, for example, a manual on how you fix your Volvo car, whereas the poetic side might be a book like James Joyce's Ulysses, which is impossible to understand, but very, very beautiful. And Mimesis is about that side, the sensuous side, the poetic side, and is arguing that there is a social role for design in making us feel at home because we have that urge in the first place. So in a sense, this is the hotel room, maybe, that you couldn't afford to go to. A hotel room designed by Zaha Hadid architects. In fact, it was designed by someone who was one of my students who was reading my work on camouflage at the time and was very much influenced by this. This idea of the sensuousness, this is what allows the building, the design, to be connected in some way. You come in here and immediately you feel yourself as though you're being absorbed into this kind of womb-like cocoon, and it's completely welcoming, and you can see the role of design in making that connection. But it doesn't have to be curvilinear. It doesn't have to be a blobby form. It doesn't have to be a Zaha Hadid architect. It could also be a kind of David Chipperfield architecture. It could also be a kind of rational, logical, modernist thing like the Bauhaus itself, because it also has a similar effect. It's not then about a style, it's about a certain sensibility, a sensibility towards design that is infused by a poetic sense of sensuous correspondence. It is therefore the role of the aesthetic to make us feel at home. The world, it has a social role. Beyond all the critical things we were saying in the last 2 days about the negativity of aesthetics, about what is being lost when we obsess with images, there's also an important social role, the social role that Adorno points out in the context of social activities such as dancing. So the final section I want to just, and this is more speculative in some senses, I'm interested in the notion of the model itself. And what we find throughout the discourse of mimesis is this idea that somehow modeling is central to what that is. When you understand, when you are trying to understand what it's like to slip over banana skin in the joke about, with Charlie Chaplin, you are modeling yourself on that. You're imagining yourself as that particular person and recalling bodily memories and trying to put yourself in that situation, trying to identify, trying to assimilate. And that same process of a kind of replication of a modeling is what's happening within the aesthetic domain. So let me just read this out briefly. To understand the meaning of mimesis in Benjamin, we must recognize its origin in the process of modeling, of making a copy of. In essence, it refers to an interpretive process that relates either to modeling oneself on an object or to making a model of that object. Likewise, mimesis may come into play as a third party engages with that model, and the model becomes a vehicle for identifying with the original object. In each case, the aim is to assimilate to the original object. Mimesis is therefore an operation, therefore an operation that may be evoked both by the artist who makes the work of art and by the person in experiencing it. Just to go back to my original comment about this notion about imitation, AI is not imitating at all. But we could argue that humans are imitating, but at the same time, they're not imitating. The whole process of imitation becomes something else when seen through the lens of this. Now, the curious thing that I've often come across is when I'm faced with the notion of the model and modeling, which is central to neuroscience. Now, this is just speculation, and I can't say much about this, but we could ask the question, when we hear the notion of the model and modeling in neuroscience about how we behave, is this the same model, the same notion of modeling that we're talking about in terms of architecture? It seems to me what they're talking about in neuroscience is the idea is conceptualizing, modeling a certain thing as a way to understand it, but I would also argue that that is a way to relate to it in the first place. So let me just play you a section by Blaise Guiriakos. There are many references in this talk, which he gave for the Doctoral Consortium many years ago, to the notion of the model and modeling. In fact, we can find them throughout many of the sessions we had on neuroscience. Okay, here we go.
Is the real article. So I'm a follower of Turing in this way. The idea of the Turing and the Turing test, the imitation game, is that because you don't have access to the internal state of another being, and we're all basically just modeling each other and also modeling ourselves, by the way. I mean, what I think is often lost in this idea about consciousness and intersubjectivity is that one of the reasons we have it and that it's so adaptive and so powerful is because we also are modeling ourselves all the time. That's what self-consciousness is, but that's also the basis for doing anything like long-term planning. It's about empathy for yourself in the future, if you like, or about thinking about, about what will happen when you, go out and do this thing, or yourself next year, or what have you. So yeah, I think that it's actually very telling that that sequence models were greatly advanced in their sophistication when we brought attention to bear, when we started using attention as a mechanism. I know that Melanie and others have critiqued my use of the word attention. So maybe just to sort of say something briefly about Blaise Guiriakos. As I mentioned, he was on one of our Digital Futures sessions. He is one of the leading figures in Google. He's also one of the smartest individuals that I've ever come across. He's a neuroscientist stroke computer scientist, and he has a number of TED Talks, very, very influential TED Talks, looking at how AI was first used in order to generate images. So if you want to watch those things, you can find them on the TED on TED. So
But what he's saying here is basically the idea that mimesis is or modeling is crucial to neuroscience, to how we operate as individuals. That's how we conceptualize things. Is it the same notion of modeling that we get in mimesis? I don't know. I mean, you can have the same word, but it can mean completely different things in different places. Benjamin famously describes how translation never works. And he used the example of bread. And he said, well, for example, you can translate the word bread brought from German into French, and you get the word pain. But German bread is very different to French bread. German bread is really solid, rye bread, whereas French bread is baguettes and croissants and so on, very, very different thing. So once you see something in its context, then you can realize it gets a different sort of meaning. So is modeling in neuroscience the same as modeling in Freud in the world of aesthetics? I don't know, but it's a speculation that I want to put out there. So let me just simply read this out. Simulation and representation, in other words, should not be dismissed as some idle domain that is somehow removed from reality, a thing we looked at 2 days ago. Rather, we should recognize that it is through simulation and representation. In other words, also what we were talking about in the context of Baudrillard, the importance of simulation, but representation not seen in a critical way, but seen in a positive way as a contribution. Rather, we should recognize that it is through simulation and representation, the logic of mimesis, that culture itself operates. That's how it propagates. For culture is always representational, and it is through the principle of representation, through a process of modeling, that forms of cultural expression are propagated. In a culture of role modeling and theming, we talked about this in the context of Disneyland and saying, well, actually, think about Disneyland, not as it's different from the world outside, rather the world outside is very close to Disneyland. And the principles of Disneyland, of role modeling and theming, are central to how we operate today. In a culture of role modeling and theming, the seemingly magical invocatory logic of mimesis is constantly coming into play. The model is always somehow enchanted. Now, what I mean by that, well, first of all, let me just say that I think we need to really rethink our notions of representation. To go back to Henri Lefebvre, is a drawing just a drawing, ever just a drawing? Or is a model just a model? This is an example of some medieval painting, and what's very clear that when you see these patrons holding up a model, it's a building that they're going to sponsor, that they get built. And it has far more than that. It becomes a kind of wish image. It becomes an enchanted image that suggests way more than that. In other words, when we see a model, when we see an architectural model, doesn't it come a little bit like a doll's house? Can we not imagine it as a space in which we might be playing? Isn't that the role of these models? Not simply to be abstractions, but rather to be opening up doors into a different world. In other words, let's go back to this comment by Henri Lefebvre and to say he's misunderstood what a drawing can be. A drawing is a kind of wish image. When we draw a drawing of a building, we are imagining something. It's not a building as such, but it's opening up an entirely new world, and that is the role of the drawing. That is the role of the model. They're not just simply objects. They're not just scaled down versions of a bigger thing. Rather, we can see them in psychoanalytic terms as wish images, wish objects, objects that open up this possibility. So going back to Benjamin, there's some very beautiful comments. So Benjamin is a collector of incredible comments, and there's a wonderful comment about his own childhood. And he was a collector of things. I won't go into that story, but he was a collector of many things. And one of the things he collected were postcards that his grandmother sent him. And as a kid, he's describing how he sees these postcards, and they become wish images. They open up a world to him. And these are obviously postcards of places: Tabaz, Brindisi, Madonna di Campiglio. For I was there in Tabas, Brindisi, Madonna di Campiglio, Westerland, when I gazed, unable to tear myself away at the wooded slope of Tabas, covered with glowing red berries, the yellow and white daubed quays of Brindisi, the cupolas of Madonna di Campiglio, printed bluish on blue, and the boughs of the Westerland slicing high through the waves. In other words,
with his childlike imagination, these photographs, these pictures opened up a whole world to him. Now I'm going to finish on this very, very curious story which I came across in the context of Benjamin's work. When I first read it, hold on a second, sorry, I'm the next one. I first read it, I didn't understand what it meant. It's a comment in Illuminations. It says, a man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters into this work of art the way that legend tells of the Chinese painter when he viewed his finished painting. Now, what does that mean? A man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters into this work of art the way that that legend tells of the Chinese painter when he viewed his finished painting. I didn't know what it meant. But then later on, in a completely different book, I came across an explanation, what he was talking about. And this is the story here. And what he's basically sort of doing, he's connecting what it was like for him as a kid with his paints and brushes, with his making paintings. And they were effectively transporting him as though on some kind of magic carpet into a different world. So here's the thing, let me read it out. The story comes from China and tells of an old painter who gave his newest paintings to friends to look at. The painting was of a park, a narrow path along the water and through some foliage. To end at a small door offering entry in the back of a little house. Well, not quite this illustration, but you get what I mean. The friends looked around for the painter, but he was gone. And in the picture, he walked along the narrow path to the door, stopped in front of it, turned round, smiled, and disappeared through the crack. So was I with my little bowls and brushes suddenly in the picture. I became similar to the porcelain into which I moved with a cloud of color. This idea that somehow representation, these representational worlds can evoke something. You can become part of it and be absorbed by it and even be lost in it in some way. This is a very, very, very beautiful story of Benjamin as a child and how he worked with how his drawings, his paintings transported him as though on some magic carpet, just like the postcards he'd been seeing transported him into another world. In other words, what I'm referring to here is the associative logic of things. How when we look at something, it's not just a thing in itself, it's that world it conjures up. In other words, looking at the Madeleine cakes of Proust, they open up a world of memories. And so it is with anything, that the world of representation, it can do this to us and open things up. In other words, this world of mimicry of mimesis is transporting us into something astonishing, a little like Alice stepping through the window, the mirror in Alice in Wonderland. So I'm going to finish with this, just repeating this extraordinarily beautiful moment when Alice steps through the mirror into another enchanted world. So here's the butterfly, and the butterfly goes straight through the mirror. And that gives her a clue into thinking maybe you can walk through the mirror. She puts her hand through the mirror and discovers that you can indeed go through that mirror into another world. And this is it. In some ways, the mirror is the mirror of representation. It is a portal. It is a portal into another world. And then when they're knocking on the door saying, who's in there? Let me in, she decides she's going to escape, and she's going to escape through the looking glass, through the mirror, into another world. So there we have it. That's why I think there is something to be redeemed from this world of representation, something incredible, something very, very special. We can critique images. We can mount the critique of Baudrillard and so on. And we can be very negative about things. But even with Baudrillard, we have to be a little bit suspicious. Baudrillard, yesterday I was talking about how he was critiquing aestheticization, critiquing images. Well, there's something suspicious about that because Baudrillard himself had an exhibition of photography. I actually went to it in the UK. How can you critique images and yet do that? And Guy Debord, who also was critical about images, nonetheless made a movie about the Society of the Spectacle, and isn't that precisely that? So I want to suggest that, and as we move into the final section here, today's was the first of the final four, in a sense, looking at camouflage, there's something very, very positive about this world of representation that is very difficult to understand and difficult to grasp. This isn't easy theory, and I haven't gone into it in too much detail, but nonetheless, it opens up a whole new way of thinking about the world of architecture and thinking about the world of design itself. Just to sum up, let me just simply say this. It seems to me that the role of aesthetics, the role of design, is precisely a social one. We can see aesthetics as being kind of as rinsing out social political concerns, but it also has a social role, and it allows us to connect to the world, to be part of the world. It's not simply we can just give up the possibility, we can adapt, of course, to anything, but it's the role of design to create spaces in which we not only feel at home, we not only feel cocooned, but also ones in which we can find our place in the world. And we need to move beyond the more traditional ways of thinking about these things, the very conservative theories of people like Martin Heidegger, to engage with some of this progressive thinking, and even more especially now, to try and connect it with the world of neuroscience and trying to realize how we can conceptually frame this new approach. So I'm going to leave it there, and open up for questions. I hope that wasn't too daunting. But I think you'll get the sense, if all you get to take away from this is that image of Alice stepping through the mirror, through the looking glass, then you get a sense of really what I'm talking about, how evocative architecture can be, or designs can be, in opening up different places and creating something very, very special. So I don't know if there's some comments in the chat. Those of you who are watching the live stream, please send in your comments into on the chat, and someone will read it. Okay. There's a question in Q&A. Okay, so this is from Leo Hui. I don't know if anyone else can read this, and I don't know if you can read. You can't read my screen. Today's lesson answers the homogenized questions that you were asked on the first day very clearly. AI does not replicate. I have a different view on it. The AI looks. Okay, hold on a second. Let me read out what it says first of all. The AI looks not replication, whether because its data is large enough that the resulting result do not look like replication. Okay. AI doesn't look like replication because its data is large enough that the resulting methods do not look like replication. I don't think it's this question of the size of the data or the amount of data, although clearly the amount of data is what feeds into deep learning, and they typically say that data is the new oil. It's not about necessarily about this the amount of data, but well, maybe I don't know. It certainly doesn't replicate, that's for sure. That's something I explained. But I think what I'm trying to say also is that even we talk about imitation, which I think that human beings replicate, that humans copy, AI doesn't copy. Even though we're talking about that, I want to suggest that actually is that copying is itself never straight copying. Whenever we see something, we, as it were, appropriate it. We use it in our own particular way, and we imagine, we personalize it. It has associations. So the idea of modeling itself, it already comes with those associations. So I see it as highly kind of personal, highly kind of poetic in the way that it operates. It's not that at all. I think just to say, think about homogenizing culture. I mean, let me just say one thing and that is that Frederick Jameson has a critique of what he calls late capitalism as being this homogenizing marketplace where everything becomes the same. And you can think maybe of Rem Koolhaas's discourse of the generic city, where every city, especially in the States, they all look the same. They've all got a Starbucks, a McDonald's, a, I don't know, airport, whatever, college or something. They've all got the same. And the problem is, how do you resist that? And for Frederick Jameson, he uses the example of he's actually in the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles. He uses that example, and it's a very bewildering space. He goes into it, he lacks orientation. It's not clear where you are. It's kind of a very symmetrical space. You don't know where the entrance is and so on, all these kind of questions. And he uses it as a discussion about how do we find our place? How do we find our place in the homogenizing space of late capitalism? And he starts looking at a number of architectural theorists. He starts looking at, I don't know, theorists, Kevin Lynch, the image of the city, and he thinks that's completely banal. Then he looks at Kenneth Frampton. And Kenneth Frampton, of course, has this idea of critical regionalism that he's promoting the whole time. But he's extremely critical. There's a beautiful essay in Rethinking Architecture that I reprinted about this. And his point is this, is that when you're operating in a marketplace, even the call for difference, in other words, you can buy an iPhone in white, blue, pink, green, whatever the color, is actually not a call for difference. It's simply a feeding into the marketplace as another product on the marketplace. So in the end, when you think about critical regionalism trying to present a new form of architecture, different kind of places, isn't that not feeding into the marketplace, especially when it becomes a kind of stylistic one, merely stylistic? So what he's trying to look for, and he's someone who, a bit like Baudrillard, is critical about postmodernity and the obsession with images, but for him, there's potentially a way out because the world of the image is Janus-faced. In other words, the Roman god of entrances, Janus looks both ways, and he's saying it is both the source of our problem, but it's also potentially the way out. We are in this world of images, of homogenized images, but maybe the aesthetic itself gives us the possibility of finding our place in the world. In other words, we don't have to have different styles of building in different countries. We can have Frank Gehry. We can have a kind of like a design that is, it is the design itself that makes us feel at home in the world. And therefore, that's why he's promoting design. In some senses, the Camouflage book was trying to respond to this urge, this comment by Frederick Jameson of how do we find a viable form of aesthetic that reinserts the individual in society. I don't know if that was clear or not. Do we have any other questions? There's one in the chat. This is from Gustavo. Do you want to ask it yourself, Gustavo? Just to give a change of voice, or are you able to?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Neil, for the wonderful lecture. You showed many images about mimesis, and I actually had to go back into the different Freudian definitions or psychological conditions of that humans encounter. So mirroring is one, where you mirror. And there was another one, I'm not sure if it was extrapolation, but basically you would change who you are to the point where you would lose yourself in the image. And I think that's what you were, I think alluding to in some sense. We're growing with the technology into something yet unseen. We can reference the past, but so my question is, if mimesis is natural to the human condition, how do our tools augment that fact? AI, data, and computers, cell phones, the internet. How does group learning at the precipice, moving from the internet to an omniverse meta, like 3D modality, change our adaptations to learning and societal evolution? What do you foresee with all of the science and the theory and the philosophy? How do you see us growing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Let me just simply say that one thing that surprised me is that I didn't meet Andy Clark. as until way after I'd written Camouflage. And I think his book, Natural Born Cyborgs, came out in 2004. And Camouflage came out in 2006. It was delayed slightly, but it could also have come out in 2004. Then we had two British writers, two British theorists, talking about similar things about adaptation, but approaching it from a very different perspective. Andy Clark is a kind of neuroscientific philosopher, shall we say, a philosopher of neuroscience. And I was working through psychoanalysis. And of course, what is so interesting about those two worlds is they talk about similar things, right? And I constantly have discussions with people like Amil Seth, who we mentioned in the last two sessions, and asking, well, what do you think? Or indeed, Yosha Bach, what do you think about people like Slavoj Žižek or Freud or Lacan who raise similar ideas? And they always say, well, no, that's I don't know. The problem that neuroscientists have with that world is it's simply not grounded, shall we say, in anything that's in any way objective. It's just a kind of like Freud supposes there's an unconscious. Freud supposes they're unconscious, but that's it. And he doesn't prove it in any way. But what Andy Clark does is actually offer, and it's be very interesting just going to contrast these things in some ways. There is actually something in neuroscience called mirror neurons, which I didn't get to look at. Some people are very critical about it, but there is something called called mirror neurons. But what he does is this: there is a trajectory you can look at in terms of how do we look at tools? How do we look at tools over time? And I would say this: first of all, the person who is, I think, that is completely wrong on tools is someone called Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, who for some reason is still being celebrated in certain circles. Certainly, and I'm just blanking on it, Graham Harman, who teaches at SciArc. He wrote his PhD on Heidegger and tools. I mean, I can't think why a progressive school like that is engaging with such a conservative theoretical approach. But Heidegger's point is that tool is either out there and we use it, or we don't know what the hell it's about, and it's just out there. The next step in the process was basically the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who talks about actually we're always adapting and appropriating these tools. They become part of us. And he talks about how somebody who's walking, a blind person with a walking stick, that stick is an extension of his body schema. It becomes literally part of how he's operating. Now, the next one is the next step is actually Andy Clark and David Chalmers, whom we mentioned yesterday, or the first session, David Chalmers, and this discussion about reality. And that is the notion of the extended self. And what they talk about is how this thing, the simple iPhone, or the mobile phone, the cell phone, becomes an extension of ourselves. We effectively, we store our numbers there. We don't have to memorize them, but we store our numbers there and things, and we use it all over the place. If everyone's ever lost their phone, I'm sure we all have, or the phone doesn't work, we suddenly become kind of like, we become like useless. I mean, because we're effectively cyborgs. We're effectively cyborgs, and we use these technologies as an extension of the self. And that's, of course, what Elon Musk points out. The same thing. We are cyborgs. Everyone in this lecture, listening to this lecture, is a cyborg. And that doesn't mean to say something out of the movies. The $60 Billion Man, all these movies are fantasizing about these kind of strange techno-humans, but rather a simple walking stick, a simple iPhone, a simple pen, a pair of glasses, anything like that makes us cyborgs. Now, the next step then was this book, Natural Born Cyborgs, talking about that and how looking at it from a kind of a neuroscientific point of view. And what the point that he's making in that thing is in that book is to say that it is because of the plasticity of the brain, and this is an important concept in neuroscience. The brain is plastic. It's what allows us to adapt to these new tools. In fact, the body itself is plastic too. You'll notice how someone who's been playing golf has a completely different physiognomy to someone who's been playing football or tennis or whatever. We adapt, and so too the brain adapts. The brain adapts these tools, and they become appropriated as part of that logic. Now, that logic also can be taken in the context of AI, because the concept that's used these days is not that it's about humans versus artificial intelligence, but how AI can become this prosthesis. This prosthesis to the human imagination, it can extend our capabilities. So what I would say in the context, let's say, of if we can use the word creativity, AI allows us to become more creative. It's a tool that extends the possibilities of what we can be. So from that perspective, I think that these, maybe to answer your question in some senses, is absolutely any tool of any kind can extend the possibilities. And we have to realize that we remain in charge. It's not as though, and this is a comment that Andy Clark makes to Catherine Hales. Catherine Hales talks about, oh, we're now in a post-human world where, you know, it's all about technology. And Andy Clark saying, no, we're not in a post-human world. We're precisely in a human world. And it's the fact that we humans, because of the plasticity of the brain, are able to adapt to these things. That is what makes us human, and that is why we're still in charge. So in some senses, at least for now, we are still in charge, and these become a prosthesis that enable us to do various things much more quickly.
Thank you for your answer. You have 3 questions on the chat and 1 more on Q&A.
Okay, let's go on the chat first of all. So Vasco, okay. Hi, Vasco. Vasco's in Bangladesh. Considering the ethical implications of mimesis in architecture, how does the replication and imitation of architectural forms and styles impact cultural heritage and the authenticity of place? Well, that's a good question. I think that so what I would critique is the kind of the approach, and I can recall that when I was in Dhaka in Bangladesh, everyone was subscribing to Kenneth Frampton and critical regionalism. Everybody. But I see that as a very negative thing, because what he's effectively doing, he's talking about a kind of an architecture, a stylistic architecture in a way, that responds, that is related to a place. And yet, in some ways, you know, we operate in a different sort of world these days. So when I see, and there was an example which I didn't show, but we spoke about in our session in Homi Baba, where there was this building, and I think it was in Malaysia or Indonesia, a very traditional Malaysian building, looking like a traditional building, with a kind of BMW or something outside it, and you knew that inside it was air conditioned and so on. In other words, what it was that gave the form to the traditional buildings, and let's not forget there are some aspects of traditional architecture, like for example in Iran, there are these things called badger. They're kind of their wind catchers, and they're astonishing. They work incredibly well. A kind of natural form of air conditioning. They're very, very clever, and they're very, very effective. And it's interesting that people like Norman Foster are now using them in our buildings. But if we're just talking about air conditioning, then the question is, why does a building in Indonesia have to look like a traditional building? And when it operates in a completely different way. So I think the question of performance is important when it comes to architecture as well. And I'm not talking about imitative architecture. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about the process by which we can adapt to the world and need to adapt to the world, and therefore the role of good design. So I would say, rather than critical regionalism, the answer is ultimately in sophisticated design, without going into any particular details. And of course, one of the comments that is made by Adorno in this thing is that it has to relate in some way to time. So, you know, Baroque related to a certain set of values during the period of the Baroque and so on, and therefore, without defining precisely how this is manifested, it's more about the sensibility of the design that feeds into it, this idea of a centrist correspondence. And that's the second question. Can mimesis be a tool for cultural preservation, or does it risk eroding cultural diversity? And I mean, no. I mean, I just to clarify, I'm not talking about mimicking styles. I'm talking about mimicry as being the process of how we relate to things around us. There are things like memes, right? The way that culture is propagated. In fact, the notion of the meme, although we use it in a different context, it came from Richard Dawkins, and he spoke about how things are propagated not just in a kind of vertical way, and we think about maybe the way that we have genetics or something as a way of propagating, but also how they work in a kind of like a horizontal way. They kind of leap, ideas, catchphrases, fashion, all these things kind of propagate through that kind of logic. So it is the engine behind it is a form of mimicry, but I'm not talking about mimicking exact forms. Okay, is this one yours, Gustavo? I've always had the feeling that your idea of mimicry was a fundamental basis for cultural creation. Do you like Topo Chico and Chick-fil-A? This is not your question. Okay.
No, that's from Yep Yep.
Oh, from Yep Yep. I see. Okay. They fit well together, logo and story-wise, but not at all related. I don't know Chick-fil-A. I know it's some kind of cheap restaurant. Apology. Topo Chico. Topo Gigi is a human. I'm not sure who these are. Yeah. Well,
there's another question on the Q&A, and I can give you references on those. Give me 1 second.
Okay, anonymous Cindy. Okay, models and simulations are like children opening their own magical boxes, triggering from images to design environments. Play hide and seek with yourself and the outside world. You can find the shadow of the outside world, and you can also find your own transparent part. Is this talking about prior experience and human communities influencing each other like a neural network? Let me read that one again. Models and simulations are like children opening their own magical boxes, triggering from images to design environments. Play hide and seek, and with yourself and outside world, you can find the shadow of the outside world, and you can also find your own transparent part. Is this talking about prior experience and human communities influencing each other like a neural network? Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say necessarily it's not about the past, because I think the point is every form of interpretation, every form of copying is a new act in itself. So it's more about looking forward. If I were to think of a particular kind of theoretical framework by which to kind of look at these things, there's this logic of what we call emergence. Emergence is the kind of the emergence of certain behaviors that come out of swarms. And when agents operate together, operate with each other, then a kind of bottom-up behavior appears. Now, the typical example of this is the flock of birds, right? You get all these birds. Now, the theory, at least, is there's not a single bird that is leading the pack. It's all a kind of, we're all kind of watching each other and things, and somehow through this bottom-up process of relating to one another, something emerges, something new emerges. Now, I would argue that that's a very interesting model for talking about how anything emerges, how a language emerges, or a kind of personal language emerges, or slang or anything, or indeed art or fashion or something. It's this interaction with one another in a bottom-up way that allows things to spread. And that's a very beautiful concept, the notion of emergence, the idea that we are all agents within a multi-agent system and operate together, and out of that culture emerges. Of course, it's never quite like that. I mean, there's a comment that's been made, I'm just blanking on his name, but one of the I produced a book with Roland Snooks on swarm intelligence, because a while back processing was really, before AI was processing, right? Before artificial intelligence, it was swarm intelligence. So I lost my track of thought there a second. Yeah, so it's never, in that book we have an essay called the bottom up is never enough. In other words, things are never quite that straightforward. Even Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a very interesting example of a bottom-up process, or largely bottom-up process, that produces something that is much more effective, much more dynamic than, say, the old-fashioned encyclopedia. But even with Wikipedia, there's somebody in a top-down way who's editing the thing and the process and making controlling it in some way, or at least processing in some way. So it's never completely bottom-up. But the idea of there being some emergent forms of cultural behavior, I think that's what you're getting at, whoever that question is that. So what's happening with it, just to be quite clear about this model of the flock of birds, it's a really interesting model. What's happening, according to the theory anyway, is each bird is just following the bird in front and the birds on either side and going broadly in the same direction, broadly the same speed. But what happens out of that, the collective behavior, something that is not controlled starts developing, and the flock of birds starts swooping in one direction or another. And that's what makes it this spectacular choreography in the sky when you see starlings coming down to roost. They call it murmuring, a very, very beautiful sort of process and things. But what's interesting also is the fact that if you're inside this flock of birds, you don't know what it looks like from the outside. Or you're just a bird in the flock. You've got no clue what it looks like. But from the outside, there's someone taking a movie and saying, "This is incredible. Look at that. Look at those starlings and the form they're making." And so, in a way, this is also a critique of the notion of style. In a sense, when we are operating as architects, we're not necessarily aware of what we look like from the outside, what we're producing. We're just part of this kind of flock, part of this swarm intelligence of architects. It's only from the outside that you get historians like Mario Carpo. This is part of the problem. He's an historian and therefore doesn't understand what's going on in the design process, design culture. To the outside, you can see it, but when you're inside it, you're part of it. I don't know any architect who really thinks they're working in style, apart from Patrick Schumacher. And of course, for the Zaha office, you have to have an in-house style. You can't exist without it. I'm not sure that answers your question, but the book Emergence, I would say, by Stephen Johnson, is really, really interesting. There had been some research on swarm intelligence done by some scientists, and it's kind of scientific, right? And this is part of the problem in some senses. We weren't able to read it because of the way that it had been written. Stephen Johnson comes on as a writer, and he represents in some ways the same ideas, but makes them absolutely understandable. And that's in some sense the logic of mimesis. In sense, it is not mechanical, it's not logical, it's not rational in that kind of way. It doesn't refer to the kind of logic of, let's say, the Volvo manual, how you fix your car. It's about some kind of poetic gesture that makes sense of things, that allows people to relate to the world outside. So in the end, it's kind of like a call for a kind of centrist way of using language, whether that's architectural language or any other kind of language. I don't know if we have any other questions.
I followed up with Yep, and she Yep continued. But here's I put that in the
hold
chat.
on, there's 7 new ones. I'm planning.
I added the links for Topo Chico and Chick-fil-A so that you can see what she's talking.
Flock of birds model. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I see that. Okay. I'm not sure I've got time to click on all those ones. Okay, I can see what Topo Chico is.
Yeah.
I'm out of touch with
Chick-fil-A is a chicken sandwich.
Okay. Okay. I'm not. Oh, I see. Okay. This is kind of cans of. Is it Mexico? I don't know what it is. Sparkling water of some kind. Okay. Oh, right. I'm not sure if I can answer. I'm sorry. Yep. I don't know. I need to familiarize myself with those. Yeah. Okay, now I've learned something today. Anyway, so I mean, I think like we can wrap it up. One new message. Yeah. Do any of the students have a question? This is, I mean, I think that this kind of theory is well, I was teaching these things at the AA and Columbia and Cornell and schools like that, and SARC to some extent. It's very much, I wouldn't say a Western discourse, but it's not in China. I think you guys have yet to develop this kind of theoretical approach and the tools and so on. It's very novel. I did give a talk on these things in 2004 in CAFA, and it was kind of disconcerting because whereas in Europe I could talk about them and people got what I was talking about, everyone was just taking, I was showing these animals that were camouflage, and they were all taking photographs of the animals. I think that was as far as they understood this thing. But I mean, if you could just simply think through that, I think there's that Alice in Wonderland thing of stepping through the mirror, the mirror glass, the looking glass, into another world. That would give you some clue. Maybe I should just finish on a kind of comment that I was in Brighton with Andy Clark, and Andy Clark lives in Brighton, and the book Alice in Wonderland was, there are lots of different claims, but there is a claim that the people in Brighton say it was written here, and there is a square called, I think, Sussex Gardens, I think it's called, on Marine Parade, looking out over the ocean, over the sea, and there's a tunnel that goes down to the beach. Now that supposedly is the tunnel that inspired this idea of the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. But it's I'm not quite sure if that's the truth or not. But anyway, that whole kind of myth of Alice in Wonderland is there, and for sure, if you're in the UK, go to Brighton, because it has, apart from the fact it's a fun place to go to, I mean, they have this amazing pavilion there, the Royal Pavilion from 1780 something, I don't know what it was built, that is most bizarre, but kind of magical in its own kind of way. And it gives you a sense, I think, of that kind of the space of Alice in Wonderland, the kind of the way in which you can imagine a really magical kind of space in which to operate. So I would just, I would say, go to Brighton. It's kind of fun, and yeah, I used to teach there. Okay, so let's wrap it up. Can I just say thank you? Chao's not here because he's got to go teach, but thank you for everyone for setting this up. Thank you also to the whole Digital Futures team. And thank you for the questions. Gustavo, it's always good to have you around to ask questions. And let's hope we can get more questions coming in the next 3 sessions from our Chinese students. I know there's not a culture of asking questions, but maybe I can provoke you to do that. And just to say, the next 3 sessions are kind of taking different aspects of camouflage and kind of connecting them in some way. The session tomorrow, I'm particularly interested in the whole thing about whether AI is conscious or not. There's been a huge debate about whether AI is conscious, and that's going to be feeding into this whole thing about animism and so on, and so on. I think they can find my book. Just a question on the chat, and I think there's I put it into my website. Unfortunately, the website's out of date. It still says I teach at the USC, partly because I've lost my password, and the email that I used for it in the first place I don't use anymore, so I can't get back to the website. But it's on there, and you can click on it and get this book. You can also buy it on Amazon. Camouflage is MIT Press, and it's a very beautiful book. It's a very, very beautiful book. But don't be put off. It's challenging. I think it's a fantastic book. I would also say, though, that it's kind of like, in a sense, it says a lot about architecture, because I think most architects just look at picture books, and this is about theory. So anyway, so let's wrap it up, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. thank you for, maybe I should just, well, before I'm going to share the, can I share the share what this is Topo Chico. For those of you who don't know what Topo Chico is, this is Topo Chico. Okay, all right. So thank you, and see you guys tomorrow. Thanks.